Homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm. Tonight, as part of the Pantry Challenge, we are going to be making turkey pumpkin chili. This is a really nice, healthy chili and a great way to use up any lingering winter squash that you might have in your pantry, along with some pantry staples. So I have some black beans. I actually have some not black beans because that was my last jar of black beans. So we're gonna use a mix of beans, and then I have some canned tomatoes from actually 2021. I think this is my last jar from 2021. And then I've already got some pumpkin made up. And then the turkey in this recipe actually came from our own birds that we butchered back probably in September. And they were older birds, most of them. And so rather than trying to leave the parts whole, we just ground the meat so that we would have ground turkey for things like this. So come on along and let's see how we do. I know this is gonna come as a complete shock, but we're gonna start this recipe with an onion, which is pretty much what we've done for probably half the recipes that I've posted on this site. This is actually one of my garden onions that's starting to sprout. And so there's going to be quite a bit of waste on this, and then I have some other onion that I'm going to use as well. The recipe calls for 2 large onions, which is quite a bit of onion. That's probably about 4 cups chopped, but we're going to start with this one. Onions, I grow my own. It's definitely an inexpensive thing to buy at the store, so it's definitely not something you need to grow your own of, especially if you're short on gardening space. But there's something that makes me feel so gardening rich when I have a pantry full of onions that I've grown myself. Onions are day length specific, and so if you're living in the north part of the United States, you want a north onion. If you are living in the southern part of the United States, you want a short day or southern onion. North day are long day onions. And then if you're kind of in the middle, you can get away with something called a day neutral onion. But the reason for that is certain onion varieties, they are triggered to start forming the bulbs based on the day length. And so depending on where you are in the country, that day length is going to vary a lot. And we happen to be quite a bit north, and so I grow long day onions, and then I'm specifically looking for storage onions. The sweet onions that everybody loves that are so popular, and of course I'm in Walla Walla, Washington, and that we are famous for our sweet onions. They are not a storage onion. They do not do well in long-term storage. So there's something to enjoy in the summer, and then you're done. They will not store. They are really moist. They have a lot of water in them, and so they don't store well. I buy them in the summer and enjoy them in the summer, and then I have a lot of storage onions on hand for this time of year. And I don't love a sweet onion for every single use. It really is something that's special, and it isn't something you can just throw into any recipe because they are quite a bit sweeter than a typical onion would be. I grow my onion from seed. A lot of people like to buy onion plants or onion sets, and I did that for years when I was first learning to garden. And what I learned was that I did not have great luck with those. The onion sets, which are the ones that look like little bulbs, those always seem to send up a flower stalk on me. And once they've sent up a flower stalk, they don't store very well. Onions are a biannual, which means that they produce seed the second year, and the first year is all just vegetative growth. And when you buy those sets, that onion actually thinks that it's been through its first year of growth already. And so by the time you put it out for the second year, especially if you plant them early when it's cold, they absolutely think that they've been through a winter, and they will send up a flower stalk. They're totally edible. There's nothing wrong with that. And you can cut that flower stalk off and try to get a bigger bulb. The problem is they just don't store well once they've done that. And so you'll have them in storage and they pretty quickly go bad, a lot like this onion here is doing. And so not a fan of the sets. You can buy onion plants, which honestly are similar. I've had better luck with plants than I've had with sets, but you have the same problem where they are grown out to a certain size and then put in cold storage to make them go dormant, and then they send those out in the spring
as onion plants. And the problem again is they think they've been through a winter, and so they often send up a flower stalk, and those don't store well. My other experience was even when an onion from a set or a plant did not send up a flower stalk, it was often a what I would call a split, which is when you seem to have, instead of one nice round perfect onion head, you've got multiple onion heads in there, and they're kind of, like you've got two and they're kind of funky shaped. Those never store as well for me as the ones that are round and perfect. And so I kept ending up with a lot of splits, and then they would also go soft in storage, and that was frustrating. So I finally just gave up and decided to learn how to start onions from seed. I start them at the same time that I start my tomatoes and peppers, so pretty early spring, and grow them out. And I don't put them in the ground until May. You can plant them earlier. They do have pretty good frost tolerance, and I have them in my greenhouse during that time, and I don't worry too much if we're gonna get a cold spell and my greenhouse is gonna get really cold, because I know they'll survive. But I think they do better in terms of making a bulb if you don't plant them out too early. And so even though you can, kind of like carrots, even though you can start them really early, I think you actually get a much better crop if you do not. With carrots, it's more of a germination thing. I think you get much better germination if you plant them a little bit later when the soil is warm. So yeah, just some tricks that I've learned over the years growing onions. I try to grow enough onions that are storage varieties that I have at least 2 onions a week for the entire year. And so if there's 52 weeks in a year, that means that I try to have on hand at least 100 onions, if not more. Generally what happens is, as I start to get into February, March, and April, I get more of what you've seen here, which is they're starting to sprout. And that is partially the storage conditions that they're in, but it's also very much the variety that you're growing. Some onions are just simply better at long-term storage than others. I actually did a really deep dive into this on my blog post, and I'll put a link to that. I did trials where I specifically wanted open pollinated onion varieties, not hybrids, because I wanted to be able to grow them out the second year and save seed, and then be able to continue growing them from that seed. And you can do that from a hybrid. You can certainly grow a hybrid from seed, but it is not going to come true to what you started with. And so I was searching for open pollinated yellow storage onion varieties, and surprisingly there are not that many kinds out there. And so I ended up ordering onion seed from, I don't know, 4 or 5 different seed catalogs. Often they had one variety, or the open pollinated variety that they did have was a sweet onion. You see Alyssa Craig a lot as an open pollinated onion, and that is a sweet onion, so really not the best for storage. Anyway, long story long, I grew them all out and then put them in storage, and then actually I put 10 each of a good nice sample variety of good specimens of each variety, and put them in storage, and then just tracked like which ones sprouted first and what percentage had sprouted in February, in March, in April, and I think maybe even into May. And then from there I determined which variety seemed to be the best one for my area. And then from there, the ones that sprouted the very latest, I actually put in the ground next to each other and let them go to seed, and let that seed cross, because onion is an outcrosser, and so it will pretty easily cross with any other onion that's around it. And then I saved seed from that, and so I've been growing that out as kind of my own personal, suited well to this area onion seed variety that I've made up for here in Walla Walla. It's been a fun project. Here is another onion from my crisper that's been in storage, and you can see it's also starting to sprout just a little bit, and interestingly it's starting to try to grow roots again. So yeah, he's ready to go. It's part of why I pulled it out. It needed to get used. There is a slight flavor change I find in onions once they've started to sprout, and if they've really started to sprout, I notice it enough that I don't like it. And so once I see any kind of a sprout, I really try to use them. I either use them in the kitchen, or I just chop them up and throw them in the freezer so that they're, in stasis and I can use them later. You can also can onions. There's a really interesting ball recipe for a French onion soup that you can do with onions that are all starting to go, that aren't going to stay in storage a whole lot longer. That is a pressure canned recipe, but that's a good way to store them long term. And I have not had great luck with long-term storage of either red onion or of white onion. I've grown both of those varieties. The white onion especially just really doesn't hold. And then the red onion, I've got a variety that's better than most, but it's still not nearly as good as the yellow. So it's interesting. I don't know what that's about, but the colors seem to affect how long they store as well. This is going to be a pain to chop because I cut that bottom root off. Usually I leave that on so that the pieces hold together. Because this is kind of a chunky chili, I'm not too worried about this being super fine. You can tell I'm kind of cutting things into bigger pieces than I often do. The other thing that can affect onions is whether or not they were bred specifically to grow in organic conditions. And so one of the winners of my long-term growth and storage trials happened to be one that had been specifically selected over time for organic growing conditions. So a little less rich soil. And that was interesting that I had kind of forgotten that when I was doing all the trials, that was something that was noted in the catalog. And then when it turned out to be the winner, I did a little bit more research on it, and that was one of the things that it had been bred for. So if you are growing in organic conditions with a lot of compost and manure versus if you're putting synthetic fertilizers on the soil, that can make a difference in terms of what kind of production you're getting. And so it's nice when you can find varieties that somebody has bred specifically for organic production. And there's some good hybrids out there. I don't dislike a hybrid. I just really wanted to be able to save my own seed. Because we're in such an onion growing area, it seemed like a fun project. Okay, so I've got about 4 cups of onions here, which is about what I should have for 2 large onions, so that's about right. This is a Cook's Illustrated recipe from Nutritious and Delicious, which I really like as a cookbook. And one of the things they have you do is mix your turkey with a little bit of baking soda, and that baking soda changes the pH of the meat, which then changes the way the actual structure of the meat responds and keeps things a little bit more juicy. Turkey meat can dry out really quickly because it tends to be quite lean, and so that is their trick, and it's a tiny amount. It's a 1/4 teaspoon per pound of turkey meat. This is a pound. I actually have a second half-pound pack that I'm going to just go ahead and use in this recipe, so it's going to be a little more meat than normal, just because I've had it languishing in the bottom of my freezer for a while and I wanted to use it up. Yeah, this is from March of 2021, so that's pretty old. This bottom meat has a lot of the leg and thigh meat in it, especially the thigh meat. This is pretty much all breast. And so there's kind of a mix there. And that first piece that I put in there still had there's still some ice in there from coming out of the freezer. So to this, I'm gonna add, it would normally be a 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda per pound. I have about 1.5 pounds here. So I'm just gonna kind of eyeball a little bit less than 1/2 teaspoon. And then the same amount of table salt. And then they suggest just a little bit of water. So about 1.5 tablespoons of water here for the amount of meat that I have. And I think that's mostly just to kind of get that salt and baking soda dissolved in there. And we're just going to really lightly toss this. I'm not squishing it. I'm not packing it down. I'm trying to keep things loose so that the meat stays tender when it's cooked. And I just watched a video of theirs, of Cook's Illustrated, yesterday on turkey burgers, and they used this same technique with turkey burgers, and they were very clear about don't squish this meat. Try to keep it very light and not packed. Okay, so we're gonna put that aside and let that sit for a bit. The other thing I'm gonna need here is 2 bell peppers. And I'm just using frozen chopped bell pepper. A bell pepper is about a cup. And so I'm just gonna add 2 cups of chopped bell peppers to this. Love having my beautiful vine ripened garden bell peppers in the freezer for use in recipes like this. The original recipe for this calls for making your own chili powder, and that is an awesome thing to do if you have the time and energy. I actually do that, but then I have it ready to go, and so I'm just gonna measure out my own chili powder, but they call for some ancho chilies, and anchos are a really lovely chili. They are not particularly hot. They have a little bit of warmth to them, but nothing dramatic. They also call for cumin, coriander, oregano, and paprika. And honestly, that's pretty much what this is. So I'm just gonna use my own chili powder. I think I probably have some onion powder in mine as well. Sorry, not onion powder, garlic powder. There is some garlic powder in this as well. All right, so I've got a nice deep pot here. Finally gonna be smart and use a smaller burner so that I don't overcook things too quickly. I need a couple tablespoons of oil. I'm gonna use, it calls for olive oil. I'm gonna use grapeseed, and I'm just gonna kind of eyeball this. All right, I'm gonna get this going. I'm also gonna add a half a teaspoon of salt to this, which is gonna help release moisture from those vegetables, also called sweating. And we're just gonna saute this on medium heat for about 8 minutes until everything is warmed up and looking translucent and looking yummy. And we'll bring you back when that's ready. So this is what we're looking at after 8 minutes. We've released a lot of liquid. And those onions, some of them are translucent, but some of them are still pretty white, pretty opaque. So I'm gonna give this a couple of more minutes. The fact that those peppers were frozen has definitely, you know, it took a while for everything to get going. So I'm gonna give this a couple of more minutes before we start adding in our turkey. All right, we gave this about 4 more minutes, and I can just tell by the sound that it is definitely a whole lot less liquid in there. We're getting a lot more actual direct heat on these onions, which is what I was looking for. So that's good. And this kind of almost sticky softening that you're seeing here, that is because that onion sprouted. I noticed there's a distinct textural change between cooking a sprouted onion and cooking a non-sprouted onion. So I would attribute that stickiness that I'm seeing here to the fact that those onions were a little bit sprouted. I'm guessing it's a conversion of starch to sugar, sugar to starch, I'm not sure which, that happens inside the onion when it's starting to sprout that changes that texture a little bit. And that's probably where the flavor change comes from as well. Okay, we're gonna add in our turkey. And we're gonna brown this just until it's not raw. It is not gonna take very long. We are not wanting to overcook this, so we are gonna be careful here to just get it cooked through. It's obviously gonna cook much longer once we add in all the liquid, but by the fact that we're sauteing this, we're gonna get a little bit more flavor out of it than we would if we just added our liquid now. So just like many, many recipes you've probably made from ground meats, we're just gonna cook this and keep breaking it up until it's cooked through. We've gotten our turkey cooked off. It's looking good. And I'm gonna add in our spice mixture. So this is about 4 tablespoons of homemade chili powder. And if you're interested in making your own chili powder, One of my old blog posts actually has, it's kind of a blog post on making your own spice mixes, and the recipe that I typically use is in there. It's better when you have multiple kinds of chilies in it. And so mine is mostly ancho, but it has some, I think, New Mexican chilies and maybe some cayenne. I can't remember. I often vary it depending on what chilies I happen to have on hand. Although I grow anchos every year specifically for chili powder because they are such a great base chili powder note. But you can make your own pretty easily, and so I encourage you to do that. And then I'm also going to add in our garlic. And this is 6 cloves of garlic, and they're on the large side. And just like my onions, some of my garlic is also sprouting. And you can read different things online about how important or not important it is to take out that little green sprout in the middle of your garlic. If it's protruding out of the top of the actual clove, I often do take it out, which is why these garlic cloves are split. If it's still all the way in the clove and I just see it when I cut the clove open, I don't worry about it too much. It's a minor thing. There's some thought that it contributes a little bit of bitterness to the dish. And hardneck garlic stores less long than soft neck, and so this is a hardneck variety here that is sprouting. I think my soft necks are still holding pretty well. And I'm just going to get that stirred in. What we're doing here is called blooming the spices, and so while this temperature in here is still got some pretty good heat, we don't have a ton of liquid, and there's some nice oil in here. All of those spices are going to release some of their lovely volatile oils into that oil that's in the pot because of that extra heat and that little bit of more dry toasting, although clearly this pan is not super dry. And you just want to stir everything in until you smell it, and especially with garlic, usually 30 seconds to a minute is about all you need. There's a lot of moisture in here, so I'm not worried about anything burning. If this was really dry, you would really have to watch it closely because it would be really easy to accidentally burn those spices because they're so finely ground that they'll burn very quickly. So here is our 32-ounce jar of tomatoes. And those look a little chunky, but they're gonna break down just from cooking. And then we're adding in a cup of, the recipe calls for pumpkin puree. This is actually butternut squash. I had some butternut squash that were starting to go bad out in my garage storage. And generally they were going bad starting at the stem at the top. And so I just cut the tops off, cleaned them out, and then baked a whole bunch of them off in the oven and then stuck that in the freezer. And so this is from that. We're also still eating pumpkin puddings, which is a video I have on my channel. It's basically pumpkin pie filling without the crust. And so it's a really nice January dessert that we eat quite a bit. So it's healthy. You can vary how much sugar you put in it. Lately, I've been using coconut sugar in mine because I had a jar of coconut sugar, and I can't even remember why I bought it, but I've had it for a long time, and so I'm slowly using it up. Again, pantry challenge. And instead of using 3/4 of a cup of sugar, which is what the recipe calls for, I'm using about 1/2 cup, so I'm cutting the sugar down on it. And this butternut squash is so sweet that honestly it does not, you don't miss the lack of sugar or cutting that sugar by 1/3 at all. So we've got the pumpkin in there, we got the tomatoes in there. We're also going to add 2 cups of water. And we're just going to bring this to a simmer and let it cook for about an hour. And then we're going to go back in right before we're ready to eat it and add in our beans. Doesn't that look good? Yum. And this recipe says it serves 8, and it's about 230 calories a serving. That is a really low calorie for a chili. I'm sure our serving sizes are not 8. It's probably more like 6 for us, but super delicious, and we love it with avocado. So we feel like we've got a little leeway on the calories because it's so low calorie to start with. All right, we'll bring you back in about an hour when that is fully cooked and we're ready to add the beans.
All right, so our chili has been simmering along here for about an hour. I'm gonna add in 2 pints of beans. One of these is black beans. These are homegrown. And it calls for rinsed beans. I'm not gonna rinse these. It also calls for cooking this down for another 45 minutes to thicken it. And I think if we just add the bean liquid, we're gonna get thick without having to wait 45 minutes. And I would like to have dinner in less than 2 hours, so we're gonna do that instead. This particular bean is I think this was Maine. I'll put the name on the screen, I can't remember. It's also homegrown. It has a little bit of molasses in it because it was the only recipe I could find in one of the tested books for something akin to baked beans. And the reality is it is not baked beans. It does have molasses in it, but it's not a baked bean recipe, and it's not terribly sweet. And so it was kind of an experiment, and because they didn't turn out to be super sweet, I've just used them. And because there's a little bit of sweetness with that winter squash that's in here, that is not gonna hurt a thing. It's gonna be a very nice mix. So yeah, total cooking time on this recipe is like 1 hour and 45 minutes. That seems really long to me for something that is ground turkey, which is a meat that's gonna cook in a flash. So I'm not quite sure why it is so long. I'm gonna let this simmer for about another 15 minutes now that I've added the beans in there. Leave the lid off and kind of let the flavors marry. But I really think 2 hours is too long of a cooking time. I'm gonna taste this. I have a feeling it might need a little more salt. This particular cookbook, because it's nutritious and delicious, it tends to be pretty light on the salt. And I think salt is kind of a critical component in a chili recipe, tasting good. Yep, a little bit. And what I'm gonna do, instead of adding regular table salt, is I'm gonna put a little bit of soy sauce in this. Soy sauce is a huge umami bomb. And if you just use it judiciously in small amounts in recipes like this, it is not going to make it taste like an Asian dish. I have this giant container of soy sauce, and I usually just refill my regular soy sauce container with it. I'm not sure where my regular soy sauce container is. I'm just gonna put a teaspoon of soy in here. And then I'm also gonna add, this is some homemade hot sauce that was kind of modeled after Frank's hot sauce, which is a cayenne-based hot sauce that's got a lot of vinegar in it. And it didn't really come out like Frank's, and I used dried cayenne instead of fresh cayenne because I was trying to use up a whole bunch of dried cayenne that I had. I'm gonna put a little bit of this in here just to give it a little bit more heat and a slightly different flavor profile. That dried cayenne chili in there with that vinegar is going to be a nice mix. Feels like it needs a little touch of heat. This is a pretty mild recipe as written because it's turkey and it's probably geared more for families with kids. So yeah, let's get that stirred in. Salt, fat, acid, heat, baby. Anytime you do this, is it salty enough? Does it need some brightening with a little squeeze of acid, whether that be vinegar or citrus? Fat, is it rich enough? Does it have a nice mouthfeel? Kind of hard to correct that late in the game, but sometimes you can do things like add cream or butter, not in a chili. And then heat, does it have a little zing? Does it have a little spice? That is what makes a good chili. It's what makes most good things. Let's give that another try. That is better. I still think it needs more salt. I'm just gonna put a nice pinch of kosher in there. Because this is homegrown turkey and not store-bought turkey, a lot of times store-bought turkey, ground turkey or any kind of turkey, is gonna be injected with a brine. And so there's gonna be some saltiness in the meat. This is homegrown turkey. It has 0 salt in it. And so it just really feels like it needs a little bit more. Yeah, that helped a lot. It definitely needed more salt. All right, we're gonna let this simmer for another 15 minutes or so, and then we're gonna serve it up and have some dinner. So we've been simmering this about another 15 minutes, and I am ready to serve this up. It is past 6 o'clock, we're hungry. It is time for dinner. Improvise my dipping utensil here since my dishwasher is running with my regular ladle. See if this avocado has got any salvageability. I always forget you can freeze avocados. I've never actually done it. Well, that's a lot of that's usable. I think a lot of times this spot here where an avocado goes bad is probably where it got dropped or bruised when it was in transport. And it's such a bummer because you can't tell by looking. If this was a little fresher, I'd be able to just peel that skin right off of there, but that's not happening. It's not a perfect avocado, but it's definitely 100% usable. I have a little bit of this Cotija cheese, which is a Mexican crumbled cheese, a little bit like Parmesan. It's a perfect topper for this, so I'm going to add a little bit of that. Oops, probably a little more than I should have. And a quick squeeze of lime. Again, a little acid never hurts. We'll serve that up with some nice fresh cornbread. So there you go. It is a turkey pumpkin chili. And the home products that went into this include the turkey, the tomatoes, the onions, the beans, most of the ingredients that were in the chili powder, and the bell peppers, and the garlic. So honestly, almost everything in here is from the farm. So really great for the pantry challenge. Delicious, a really nice lighter meal for January as we're coming off of all of the holidays. So great pantry challenge meal. Give it a try. Thanks for watching, Tribe. And if you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, and drop me a comment. I've got new content coming out every week.